Snow drifted quietly across a veteran's cemetery as an old German shepherd lay beside the grave of a soldier everyone believed was gone forever. For weeks, a retired Navy SEAL watched the dog return to that same headstone, through storms, freezing winds, and empty winter mornings. At first, he thought it was loyalty. Then he read the name carved into the stone, and felt the ground disappear beneath him. Because the man honored by that grave was someone he had blamed for 17 years. A man he believed had abandoned him during a mission that changed both their lives forever. But when the dog finally led him beyond the cemetery, Ethan Mercer uncovered a truth far more painful than betrayal. He discovered that the person he had spent nearly 2 decades hating might have been the one who saved him. January settled over Jackson Hole like a silent promise. Snow covered everything: the roads, the rooftops, the fences stretching across distant ranches. Even the mountains seemed softer beneath their blankets of white, their jagged edges hidden beneath winter's careful hand. Ethan Mercer drove slowly through the drifting snowfall, the windshield wipers brushing away flakes that seemed determined to stay. The old pickup truck groaned occasionally as it climbed the narrow road leading toward the National Veterans Cemetery on the edge of town. He came here every month, not because he enjoyed remembering. Quite the opposite. Some memories demanded attention whether a man welcomed them or not. At 52, Ethan had learned that grief rarely disappeared. It simply found quieter places to sit. The cemetery appeared through the snowfall, rows of white headstones standing in perfect order against the winter landscape. Everything looked peaceful from a distance, orderly, clean, final. Ethan parked near the entrance and stepped into the cold. The Wyoming air cut sharply against his face. He adjusted the collar of his dark navy peacoat and began walking through the snow-covered paths. His boots crunched softly beneath each step. A few visitors moved among the graves, speaking in hushed voices, or standing alone with their thoughts. Most people visited quickly during winter. Not Ethan. He always stayed longer than he planned. The dead never seemed to mind. For nearly 30 minutes, he walked among familiar names, men he had trained with, men he had served beside, men who had never made it home. Some had been friends. Others had simply been faces he remembered from younger years. Either way, they were part of him now. Eventually, he reached the far northern section of the cemetery. That was when he saw the dog. Again. The German shepherd lay perfectly still beside a headstone. Snow had gathered lightly across its broad back, yet the animal made no effort to shake it away. Its posture wasn't relaxed. It wasn't sleeping. It looked as though it were standing guard. The sight stopped Ethan every time. For nearly 6 weeks now, he had noticed the same dog during his visits. Always in the same place. Always beside the same grave. Always alone. At first he assumed the dog belonged to a grieving family. Then he assumed it belonged to one of the cemetery workers. But neither explanation had survived scrutiny. The dog appeared regardless of weather, regardless of visitors, regardless of time. As if it answered to something older than routine, Ethan remained where he was. The German shepherd lifted its head. Amber eyes met his across the snow. Neither moved. Something about those eyes unsettled him. Not because they seemed human. He hated when people said that about dogs. No. What unsettled him was the certainty in them. The patience. The strange sense that the animal knew exactly why it had come here. While Ethan did not, the dog looked away first. Slowly. Almost dismissively. Then it returned its attention to the grave. Ethan exhaled. "Fine," he muttered. "Ignore me." The wind carried his words away. Curiosity eventually pulled him closer. As he approached, he glanced toward the headstone. The name carved into the marble was already familiar. Nathan Crowley. Ethan stopped. Not because the name surprised him. The memorial had stood there for years, He knew exactly where it was, but seeing the dog beside it again created a question he could no longer ignore. Nathan had vanished 17 years ago during a classified operation in North Africa. No body had ever been recovered. No confirmed witness had ever seen him after the mission. There had been reports, rumors, speculation. None of it ever led anywhere. The military eventually listed him among the lost. Not dead, not alive, simply absent. And yet this dog kept returning to Nathan's memorial, every day, for months. Why? Ethan stared at the engraving. The old anger stirred before he could stop it. Nathan Crowley. The name still carried weight. Not grief. Not exactly. Something more complicated, something harder. 17 years was a long time to carry unanswered questions. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery. Snow swirled around the headstone. The German shepherd remained motionless, its front paws crossed neatly before it. Patient, waiting, watching. The image stayed with Ethan far longer than it should have. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly remembered a compass. Not the one in his pocket, another one. Years ago. North Africa. Heat instead of snow. Dust instead of silence. Nathan crouching beside a map while the compass needle trembled in the desert wind. The memory arrived without warning, then disappeared just as quickly. Ethan looked away. He hated memories that behaved like ambushes. They rarely arrived empty-handed. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You noticed him too." Ethan turned. A woman stood several yards away, holding a stainless steel coffee thermos. She appeared to be in her early 60s, bundled in a dark winter coat with a cream-colored scarf wrapped around her neck. Silver hair escaped from beneath a knit cap. Her expression carried the calm patience of someone who spent more time listening than speaking. Grace Holloway, the cemetery manager. Ethan recognized her immediately. They had exchanged polite greetings over the years but knew little about one another. Grace followed his gaze toward the dog. "He's here every day," she said. Ethan nodded. "I've seen him. 3 months now. Belong to somebody?" Grace shook her head. "Not that anyone can figure out." The dog remained still beside Nathan's memorial. Snowflakes landed on its muzzle and melted slowly. Grace unscrewed the thermos cap. Steam drifted upward. "We tried contacting shelters. Nothing. Nothing. We tried scanning for a chip. He wouldn't let anyone get close enough." Ethan studied the animal. "Doesn't seem aggressive." "No." Grace smiled faintly. "He just isn't interested." That answer somehow made the situation stranger. Ethan folded his hands into his coat pockets. "What does he do when the cemetery closes?" Grace took a sip of coffee. "Leaves. Where? Nobody knows." "You never followed him?" The older woman laughed softly. "I manage a cemetery, Mr. Mercer." She glanced toward the dog. "I'm not in the detective business." Ethan almost smiled, almost. Then Grace said something unexpected. "The oddest part isn't that he comes." Ethan looked at her. "It's that he never visits any other grave." The words settled heavily between them. Not any other grave, only Nathan's. The dog finally rose to its feet. Snow slid from its back. Its movements were slow, deliberate, carrying the stiffness of age. For the first time, Ethan noticed the white around its muzzle, the scar running along one front leg, the slight bend in its right ear. Old dog. Old wounds. The German shepherd stepped forward and lowered its nose briefly to the snow-covered ground before the memorial. Not touching the stone. Not touching the inscription. Just standing there for several long seconds. Then it turned away, without hurry, without hesitation, and began walking through the falling snow. Ethan watched it go. The animal never looked back. The distance between them widened with every step. Soon the white landscape swallowed most of its outline. Grace adjusted her scarf. "He'll be back tomorrow." "You sound certain." She looked toward the empty path where the dog had disappeared. "I am." Ethan said nothing. Something tightened inside him. Not fear. Not grief. Something closer to instinct, the kind that had kept him alive for years. The feeling that a puzzle piece had shifted, only slightly, but enough. Enough to reveal that the picture underneath was not what he thought it was. He glanced one last time at Nathan Crowley's memorial, then toward the place where the German shepherd had vanished. Snow continued falling across the cemetery, soft, relentless, covering tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. For 17 years, Ethan Mercer had believed the story of Nathan Crowley was finished. Standing in the Wyoming winter, watching the last traces of the dog disappear into the white distance, he realized he might have been wrong. And for the first time in a very long while, he wanted an answer badly enough to go looking for one. Ethan Mercer did not consider himself an impulsive man. Impulsive men rarely survived long in the teams. For most of his adult life, every decision had been measured, tested, and questioned before action followed. Yet 2 days after seeing the German shepherd leave Nathan Crowley's memorial, Ethan found himself sitting in his pickup truck before dawn, waiting in a parking lot across from the cemetery gates. The sky remained dark. Snow drifted lazily beneath the yellow glow of streetlights. The heater hummed softly inside the cab. Ethan checked his watch. 6:18 a.m. The cemetery would not open for another hour. He told himself he was wasting time, a 52-year-old retired SEAL sitting in a freezing truck because of a dog. The thought sounded ridiculous even in his own head. Yet he stayed. At 6:41, movement appeared through the snowfall. The German shepherd emerged from the trees beyond the northern fence. The dog moved slowly, carrying the stiffness Ethan had noticed before. Age showed more clearly now. The muzzle was heavily silvered. One shoulder dipped slightly during its stride. The old scar along its front leg became visible each time it stepped. But despite the years written across its body, the animal moved with purpose. No hesitation, no wandering. It crossed directly to Nathan's memorial. For 20 minutes it remained there, watching, waiting. Then, shortly after 7, it stood and walked away. This time Ethan followed. Not closely. Not enough to startle the dog. Years of military tracking had taught him patience. The German shepherd left the cemetery grounds and headed north through town, past a row of closed storefronts, past a church with snow piled against its stone walls, past a frozen creek where children would skate, once winter loosened its grip. Eventually the town disappeared behind them. The dog continued into open country. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. Snow-covered fields rolled toward distant mountains. Fence posts emerged from the white earth like old bones. For nearly an hour Ethan followed. Several times he considered turning back. Several times common sense reminded him how absurd this had become. Yet every time he looked at the dog ahead, the same question returned. Why Nathan? The answer felt close enough to touch. Just beyond reach, near midday, the dog finally left the main road. It crossed a narrow lane bordered by cottonwood trees and disappeared behind a weathered wooden gate. Ethan parked near the entrance. A faded sign hung crookedly from one post, Barrett Ranch. The letters had nearly disappeared beneath years of wind and snow. The property looked abandoned. A large barn leaned slightly to one side. Several outbuildings sat buried beneath drifts. The farmhouse stood alone against the winter landscape, smoke no longer rising from its chimney. The German shepherd vanished behind the house. Ethan remained still for several moments before climbing from the truck. Cold air immediately flooded his lungs. The ranch felt strangely quiet. Not empty, just absent, like a place that had recently lost its center. As he approached the farmhouse, the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch. She appeared to be in her early 30s, wrapped in a thick green winter coat. Dark hair escaped from beneath a wool hat, and her expression carried the exhausted focus of someone sorting through a life that no longer belonged entirely to her. She studied Ethan carefully. Not suspicious, just cautious. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan removed his gloves. "My name's Ethan Mercer." He hesitated, already aware of how strange this would sound. "I'm actually here because of a dog." To her credit, she didn't laugh. Instead, her eyes shifted toward the side of the house. "The shepherd?" Ethan nodded. Something changed in her expression, recognition. Perhaps relief. "You're not the first person who's asked about him." She stepped aside slightly. "You'd better come inside." The farmhouse smelled faintly of cedar wood and dust. Boxes filled the living room. Photo albums lay stacked on tables. The place looked caught between memory and departure. "My name is Claire Barrett," the woman said. "My grandfather owned this ranch." Owned. Past tense. Ethan noticed it immediately. "I'm sorry." Claire offered a tired smile. "He died 3 weeks ago." The words settled heavily inside the room. Outside, wind pushed softly against the windows. Claire poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs before continuing. "Heart attack. He was 68. Ethan accepted the mug. "Grace at the cemetery mentioned someone passing recently." Claire nodded. That would have been him. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Ethan asked the question that had brought him here. "The dog." Claire leaned back in her chair. A faint smile touched her face. "Ranger." The name seemed to fit. Strong, simple, old-fashioned. "Was he your grandfather's?" "No," the answer came immediately, without hesitation. "No, he wasn't." Ethan looked up. Claire laughed softly. That's exactly how everyone reacts. She stared into her coffee. "My grandfather spent 3 years taking care of that dog. He fed him, built him a shelter, paid his vet bills. But every time someone asked if Ranger belonged to him, he'd say the same thing." "What?" Claire's gaze drifted toward the window. "Not mine. Just waiting." A strange silence followed. Outside, snow brushed against the glass. Ethan suddenly became aware of how tightly he was holding the mug. Waiting. The word carried unexpected weight. Claire stood. "Come with me." She led him through a hallway lined with family photographs. Most showed ranch life. Horses, snowstorms, branding seasons, harvests, ordinary years. Then they entered a small office. The room had clearly belonged to Owen Barrett. Books lined the shelves. Maps covered one wall. A cast-iron stove stood cold in the corner. Claire opened a drawer and removed an old photograph. The edges had yellowed with age. She handed it to Ethan. The moment he saw it, the room seemed to tilt slightly. Nathan Crowley stared back at him. Older, thinner, but unmistakably Nathan. The same eyes, the same narrow face, the same calm expression, and beside him sat the German shepherd. Younger then, stronger, but clearly the same dog. Ranger. For several seconds, Ethan forgot to breathe. The photograph trembled slightly in his hands. Nathan, alive, not a rumor, not speculation, not wishful thinking. A photograph, proof, real. The room became unnaturally quiet. 17 years of assumptions cracked at once. Claire watched him carefully. "You know him, it wasn't a question." Ethan swallowed. "Yeah." His voice sounded distant. "I knew him." Claire studied the photograph. "My grandfather never talked much about where they met. Only that Nathan saved Ranger." "When?" "About 6 years ago." Ethan looked up sharply. 6 years. Nathan had been alive 6 years ago. The realization struck harder than he expected. All this time, all these years, while everyone else remembered, while memorials were built, while stories ended. Nathan had still been somewhere beneath the same sky, breathing, living, existing. The photograph felt heavier than paper should. Claire pointed toward a wooden frame hanging beside the desk. "You should see that too." Ethan turned. Inside the frame was a handwritten note. Short, simple, written in dark blue ink. "If Ranger ever leaves, don't stop him. He's looking for something that belongs to him." N.C. Nathan's initials. Ethan stared at them. A strange feeling moved through him. Not hope. Hope was too dangerous. Not grief either. Something more unsettling. The realization that the story he had carried for nearly 2 decades might be wrong. Not partly wrong, entirely wrong. Outside the office window, Ranger sat quietly in the snow beside an empty fence line, watching the distant mountains, waiting, as though he had been doing it his entire life. Ethan looked from the dog to Nathan's photograph, then back again. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, one truth became impossible to ignore. Nathan Crowley had survived the mission, and whatever happened afterward was far more complicated than anyone had ever imagined. Ethan Mercer left Barrett Ranch with the photograph, wrapped inside a manila envelope, and the feeling that the world had quietly moved beneath his feet. He did not drive straight home. For nearly 20 minutes, he sat behind the wheel at the end of the ranch road, watching snow blow across the windshield in loose white ribbons. Nathan Crowley was alive 6 years ago. The sentence refused to become ordinary. It moved around inside Ethan like a piece of metal left too close to the heart. He had spent 17 years placing Nathan in one box. Missing, unanswered, unforgiven. Now the box had split open, and what rose from it was not relief, it was disorder. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old military compass he carried more often than he admitted. Its brass casing was scratched, dulled at the edges from years of use. He turned it once in his palm, north held steady. Everything else did not. Claire Barrett had given him one more thing before he left, a name. Dr. Samuel Reed. According to Claire, Owen Barrett had mentioned the man only twice, both times after receiving letters from someone in Cheyenne. Owen had not explained much, but Claire remembered the name because her grandfather rarely spoke of doctors, and when he did, it was usually with the suspicion most ranchers reserved for bad weather and federal paperwork. Ethan spent the next morning making calls. Retired military physicians were not always easy to locate, but old networks had long memories. By noon, he had an address on the outskirts of Cody, Wyoming, where Samuel Reed lived in a small house behind an office that had once served as a counseling practice for veterans. Ethan drove there the following day. The weather had cleared, leaving the world painfully bright. Sunlight flashed off the snowfields. The mountains stood sharp against the sky, blue and white and indifferent. By the time Ethan reached Cody, the afternoon had softened into gold. Samuel Reed's office sat beside a quiet road lined with bare cottonwoods. A wooden sign near the walkway read Reed Counseling Scrifix, though the paint had faded and the word closed had been taped behind the glass door from the inside. Ethan knocked anyway. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached. The door opened. The man standing inside was older than Ethan expected, though not frail. Samuel Reed was tall in a narrow way, his shoulders slightly bent, his white hair combed neatly back. Wire-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose, and his pale blue eyes carried the steady attention of someone trained to hear what people tried not to say. "Ethan Mercer," Samuel said. It was not a question. Ethan went still. "You know me? I know the kind of man who knocks like that." Samuel stepped aside, and Claire Barrett called. The office smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and cedar polish. Books lined 2 walls. A framed Navy commendation hung near a window, though dust softened the glass. There were no flags, no dramatic photographs, no display of medals. Only 2 chairs facing each other and a small table between them. A room built for difficult truths. Samuel gestured for Ethan to sit. "You found the photograph." Ethan removed the envelope from his coat and placed it on the table. "I need to know if it's real." Samuel did not open it. He looked at the envelope for several seconds, then folded his hands. "It is." The answer came too quickly, too calmly. Ethan felt anger rise before reason could stop it. "You don't know what photo I'm talking about." "I know." Samuel's voice remained quiet. "Because there was only one photograph. Owen Barrett was foolish enough to keep where someone might find it. The room seemed to tighten. Ethan leaned forward. Then you knew Nathan was alive. Yes. For how long? Samuel removed his glasses and cleaned them with a soft cloth. Since he was brought back. Ethan stared at him. The ticking clock on the wall became suddenly loud. Brought back from where? Samuel replaced his glasses. North Africa. Ethan said nothing. Outside, a truck passed slowly on the road, tires whispering over wet pavement. Samuel continued. 3 months after the mission, a humanitarian aid convoy found an injured American near the border. Dehydrated, infected, half-starved. He had no identification except an old tattoo and enough classified knowledge to make people nervous. Ethan's jaw tightened. Nathan. Samuel nodded. He was alive. The words should have landed as mercy. Instead, they struck like accusation. Ethan stood abruptly and walked to the window. The snow outside looked too clean, too untouched. Why wasn't I told? Samuel let the question breathe before answering. Because by the time he was stable enough to speak, Nathan refused repatriation into his old life. Ethan turned. That doesn't happen. It happens more often than you think. Not like that. No, Samuel admitted. Not often like that. Ethan's hands curled at his sides. He had a team. He had trauma. He had people who thought he was dead. He had a mind that no longer trusted the world he came from. Samuel did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Ethan had known men who shouted because they needed to win. Samuel spoke like a man who no longer had any interest in victory, only accuracy. Ethan returned slowly to the chair. Samuel opened a drawer and removed a thin file. He did not hand it over immediately. This is not an official record anymore. Most of what matters was never written down properly. Then tell me. Samuel studied him. Are you asking because you want the truth, Mr. Mercer, or because you want someone to blame? The question struck cleanly. Ethan looked away first. For 17 years, blame had been a tool. Ugly, heavy, useful. It gave shape to what had happened in the desert. It gave a man something to hold when grief proved too fluid and shame too sharp. I don't know, Ethan said at last. Samuel nodded as if that were the first honest answer of the day. Nathan came back physically alive, he said, but not whole. The doctor opened the file. There were no photographs inside, only handwritten notes, discharge summaries, and old contact sheets. He had severe post-traumatic stress. Memory fragmentation. Night terrors, periods of silence that lasted days. Ethan listened without moving. He refused medals, refused public record, refused contact with former teammates. Why? Samuel's eyes softened, though his voice did not, because he believed every living face from that mission would ask him the same question. What question? Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Why did you come back when they didn't? Ethan felt the breath leave his body. The office fell quiet. It was not the silence of the cemetery or the ranch. It was smaller than that, closer. The kind of silence that sits between two men when one has touched a wound neither of them can see. Samuel closed the file halfway. He wasn't hiding from justice, Mr. Mercer. He was hiding from being called a hero. Ethan thought of the photograph. Nathan older, thinner, standing beside Ranger, not triumphant, not proud. Simply present. Samuel leaned back. After treatment, he drifted, shelters, ranch work, seasonal labor. Then he began volunteering with veterans who wouldn't speak to anyone else. Why dogs? Samuel almost smiled. Because dogs don't demand explanations. For the first time since entering the office, Ethan felt something in him loosen. Not enough to forgive, not enough to understand, just enough to hear. Samuel continued. Nathan found Ranger at a decommissioned working dog kennel. The dog had been injured, difficult to place, too old for some handlers, too guarded for families. Nathan saw something familiar in him and took him. Saved him, Samuel corrected gently. There's a difference. Ethan looked down at his hands. He imagined Nathan kneeling beside a wounded shepherd, speaking softly because loud words were for men who believed they still controlled anything. A small, unwelcome image. A human one. Samuel reached into the file and removed a folded note. I kept this because I thought someday someone might need to read it. He slid it across the table. Ethan did not touch it at first. The handwriting was Nathan's. Older, rougher, but unmistakable. Dr. Reed, do not tell them I survived unless I become useful to the truth. Let them keep whatever version of me helps them sleep. If Mercer still hates me, maybe that is cleaner than what he would feel if he knew. Ethan read the final sentence twice. If Mercer still hates me. His throat tightened. He hated that Nathan had known. He hated more that Nathan had been right. Samuel watched him carefully. He mentioned you often. Ethan folded the note with more care than he intended. What did he say? That you always checked your compass before you admitted you were lost. The remark came so unexpectedly that Ethan almost laughed. Almost. Then something painful moved behind his ribs. Because Nathan had said that once. In the desert, long before everything broke, Ethan closed his hand around the old compass in his pocket. Samuel stood and walked to a cabinet. He removed a worn leather notebook, black, with the corners softened from years of use. This belonged to Nathan. Ethan looked up. I can't give it to you. The doctor's voice was firm. Not yet. Why show me? Because you need to understand something before you go any further. Samuel placed the notebook on the table between them. That man did not disappear because he stopped caring. He tapped one finger lightly against the cover. He disappeared because he cared past the point of survival. Ethan stared at the notebook. For a moment, he saw not Nathan the missing man, not Nathan the supposed deserter, not even Nathan the ghost. He saw a man walking through snow with a wounded dog at his side, trying to build a life small enough that pain could not find him, and failing, because pain always knew the road home. Samuel picked up the notebook and returned it to the cabinet. If you want to know what became of him, start with the people he helped. Ethan rose slowly. The room felt different now. He had entered it, searching for confirmation. He left carrying contradiction. At the door, Samuel spoke again. Mr. Mercer, Ethan turned. Be careful with the dead who were once misunderstood. Samuel's eyes held his. Sometimes we dig them up to free them. Sometimes we only move the burden onto ourselves. Ethan stepped outside into the cold. The late afternoon sun had begun to sink behind the mountains, spilling amber light across the snow. For the first time, the brightness did not look clean. It looked exposed. He stood beside his truck for a long while before getting in. Nathan had survived. Nathan had suffered. Nathan had chosen silence. And somewhere between those facts, Ethan Mercer felt the first terrible suspicion forming. The man he had blamed for 17 years might never have betrayed anyone. He might simply have been the one who came back broken enough to carry what the rest of them could not. Ethan Mercer did not sleep well after leaving Samuel Reed's office. He did not expect to. Sleep had never been generous when the past started rearranging furniture inside his head. By dawn, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, gone cold. Beside his hand, the old compass open in front of him. The needle trembled slightly whenever his fingers brushed the casing. North still knew where it was. Ethan envied that. On the table lay 3 things: the photograph of Nathan Crowley and Ranger, the handwritten note Nathan had left with Samuel Reed, and a list of names Ethan had written from memory. Men from the mission, men who had returned, men who had not. Nathan's name sat near the center of the page, circled once, then scratched over so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. For 17 years, Ethan had carried one version of the story. It had been simple enough to survive. Nathan had left his position. The flank had collapsed. The extraction had turned into chaos. Men had died. Ethan had lived. Afterward, silence had done what official reports often did. It hardened around the missing pieces and called itself truth. By 9 that morning, Ethan had made 2 calls he had avoided for years. The first went to an old Navy contact who still owed him a favor. The second went nowhere. The third reached a woman named Vivian Hale. She called him back within 12 minutes. "I was wondering when you'd find me," she said. Her voice was clear, alert, and without apology. Ethan frowned at his phone. "You know who I am?" "I know who Nathan Crowley was." "That's not what I asked." "No," Vivian said, "but it's why you called." They met that afternoon in a small cafe on the edge of Jackson, where melting snow dripped from the roof in slow silver lines. The place smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and old coffee. Most tables were occupied by ranchers, retirees, and tourists pretending not to stare at one another. Vivian Hale sat in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a red notebook open beside her cup. She was about 50, with ash-blonde hair cut sharply at her jaw and green eyes that seemed to miss very little. Her coat was practical, dark green, still dusted with snow at the shoulders. A camera rested on the seat beside her like a quiet animal. Ethan knew her kind, not careless, not cruel. Dangerous in the way determined people were dangerous. She stood as he approached. "Mr. Mercer." "Vivian Hale." They shook hands. Her grip was firm, not performative. "Sit," she said, "before you decide you don't like me." "I already decided." That made her smile. "Good. Saves time." Ethan sat across from her. Vivian opened her notebook. "I've been researching Nathan Crowley for almost a year." Ethan kept his face still. "Why?" "Because 3 different veterans told me the same thing without knowing each other." "What thing?" "That a man named Crowley saved their lives after the war." Ethan said nothing. Vivian leaned forward slightly. "Not in combat, after, when everyone else had gone home and stopped asking." The words should not have surprised him after Samuel Reed. They did anyway. "Why come after me?" Ethan asked. "Because your name appears in more than one place." His eyes narrowed. "Where?" Vivian studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much force the truth required. "Old mission summaries, private correspondence, a restricted casualty addendum that should have stayed buried." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You have classified documents?" "I have documents that were partially declassified and badly redacted by someone who thought black marker was a religion." "Careful." "I am careful," Vivian said. "That's why I'm still asking questions instead of publishing." The cafe noise seemed to recede. Ethan looked at her notebook. "What do you think you know?" Vivian turned a page. "I think Nathan Crowley survived a mission everyone thought killed him." Ethan did not react. "I think he spent the rest of his life helping veterans and working dogs under the radar." Still nothing. "And I think someone decided long ago that his story was cleaner if it stayed unfinished." Ethan's voice dropped. "Some stories stay unfinished because finishing them hurts people." Vivian's expression changed, but only slightly. "There it is." "What?" "The soldier's argument." "And what's that?" "That silence is mercy." Ethan felt something in him harden. "Sometimes it is." Vivian closed the notebook halfway. "Sometimes it's just fear wearing good manners." For a second, Ethan thought about walking out. He even pushed his coffee cup aside. Then Vivian reached into a folder and slid a photocopied page across the table. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just carefully, as if she knew it might cut. Ethan looked down. The page was faded, stamped, redacted in thick black lines. But several lines remained visible. "Enough. Mission Incident Review. North African Theater. Extraction failure. Crowley. Nathan J. Voluntary returned to hostile zone." Ethan stopped reading. His eyes refused to move. Vivian's voice came softer now. "I don't think he abandoned you." Ethan stared at the words. "Voluntary return. Hostile zone." A memory rose before he could stop it. Heat, dust, radio static. Someone shouting that the eastern ridge had gone dark. Ethan bleeding from the side. a hand under his vest, a voice saying, "Compass later, Mercer, move now." He had always believed that voice belonged to someone else, or no one. Memory was useful that way. It could mislabel pain when the truth became unbearable. Ethan pushed the page back, but his fingers did not leave it. "Where did you get this?" An archive request. That line could mean anything. Vivian did not argue. Instead, she placed another page beside it. This one was a casualty transport note, mostly blacked out, but one sentence remained. Subject returned to unsecured area to retrieve 2 injured personnel, including EM Ethan Mercer. The cafe disappeared. For one long moment there was no snow, no coffee, no Vivian Hale watching him from across the table. Only sand, only smoke, only a man Ethan had hated for 17 years dragging him out of hell. His hand went to the compass in his coat pocket. He pressed his thumb against the brass casing until it hurt. Vivian did not speak. That was the first thing Ethan respected about her. She knew when words would be theft. At last he stood, too quickly. The booth scraped against the floor. A few people glanced over. Ethan folded the papers with hands that no longer felt steady. "I need these." "They're copies." He looked at her. "Why show me?" Vivian's eyes held his. "Because I need to know whether you're going to help me tell the truth or help everyone bury it again. There are people in this story who didn't ask to be printed, and there are people who died without anyone knowing who went back for them." Ethan said nothing. Vivian's voice softened, but her resolve did not. "I'm not looking for a villain, Mr. Mercer. I'm looking for the shape of a man who disappeared from the record, but not from people's lives." Ethan looked toward the window. Snow slid from the cafe awning in a soft collapse. Outside, the world looked bright enough to forgive itself. He was not sure people worked that way. "Don't publish anything yet," he said. Vivian leaned back. "That sounds like a request." "It is. Give me a reason." Ethan thought of Samuel's warning. Sometimes we dig them up to free them. Sometimes we only move the burden onto ourselves. He looked back at Vivian. "Because I spent 17 years being wrong about him." The admission landed between them, like a stone dropped through thin ice. Vivian's expression shifted. Not pity, recognition. That must be heavy. It should be. For the first time, Vivian closed the notebook completely. "All right." Ethan blinked. "All right. I'll wait." "For how long?" "Long enough for you to find out whether this truth belongs to the public, to Nathan, or to the people still carrying him." Ethan studied her. "You always talk like a headline. Only when tired men pretend they're not bleeding." Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. He took the copies and left the cafe without finishing his coffee. Outside, the winter sun had begun to lower behind the mountains. The street glowed with that pale gold light that made everything look briefly holy before evening took it away. Ethan sat in his truck and read the line again. Subject returned to unsecured area to retrieve 2 injured personnel, including EM. There it was. Not rumor, not guilt, not a story softened by age. A sentence. Plain, merciless. Nathan had come back for him. Ethan pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. For 17 years, he had called Nathan a coward in the private courtroom of his own mind. For 17 years, Nathan had remained silent, not because he had nothing to say. Maybe because he knew the truth would not heal Ethan until Ethan was ready to survive it. The compass lay in his palm, cold and steady. Ethan closed it slowly. Then he whispered the first honest words he had spoken to Nathan Crowley in nearly 2 decades. "I'm sorry." No answer came. No wind moved. No sign appeared. Only the snow settling on the hood of the truck, soft and indifferent. But for Ethan Mercer, the old story had ended, and the harder one had just begun. Ranger was waiting at the cemetery when Ethan returned the next morning. Not by Nathan Crowley's memorial this time. By the gate. The old German shepherd sat beside the iron fence, with snow gathered lightly around his paws. His silver muzzle lifted toward the road as Ethan's truck rolled to a stop. For a moment, Ethan stayed behind the wheel. He had expected to find Ranger at the grave again. He had expected the same vigil, the same silent ritual, the same old mystery wearing a coat of snow. But the dog was not facing the dead. He was facing Ethan. As if the question had shifted. As if the waiting had changed hands. Ethan stepped out of the truck slowly. Ranger did not move away. The dog watched him with those dark amber eyes, steady and unreadable, while Ethan crossed the snowy gravel between them. "Morning," Ethan said. It was a foolish thing to say to a dog who looked as if he had already judged the morning and found it lacking. Ranger blinked once. Ethan almost smiled, but the movement failed somewhere near his mouth. He carried Vivian's copied documents folded inside his coat pocket. He had read them until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like punishment, including EM. He could not escape that line. He had tried coffee, tried walking, tried fixing the latch on the shed door, even though it did not need fixing. Nothing helped. By dawn, one thought remained clear. If Nathan had saved him once in war, then Ethan needed to understand what Nathan had saved afterward. Not the myth, not the military file, the man. Vivian had given him 3 names before they parted. 3 people who had known Nathan under quieter circumstances. Ethan had nearly refused the list. Then he had thought of Samuel Reed's warning, and the way Ranger still returned to a grave that held no body. Some truths did not arrive as thunder. Some came as addresses written on paper. Ranger rose as Ethan approached. The dog moved stiffly but with purpose, walking past him toward the cemetery path. Ethan followed. This time Ranger stopped before Nathan's memorial only briefly. He lowered his head, not in grief exactly, more like acknowledgement. Then he turned back toward the gate. Ethan stood there, watching the dog leave the grave behind. Something inside him tightened. For weeks, he had thought Ranger was clinging to the past. Now he wondered if the old dog had simply been waiting for Ethan to stop doing the same. The first address led to a modest house outside Victor, Idaho, where a man named Lucas Bell lived beside a repair shop that smelled of motor oil, cold metal, and wood smoke. Lucas was in his late 40s, thickset, with a shaved head, a gray beard trimmed unevenly, and hands scarred from honest work. He walked with the slight unevenness of a man whose body had once been badly damaged and had repaired itself with stubbornness instead of elegance. He opened the garage door halfway when Ethan arrived. "You Mercer?" Ethan nodded. Vivian called. Lucas wiped his hands on a rag. "She said you knew Crowley. I served with him." Lucas studied him for a moment. Not impressed, not hostile, measuring. Then his gaze moved to Ranger, who stood beside Ethan's truck. The man's expression softened immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," Lucas whispered. He stepped out into the cold, lowering himself slowly to one knee. Ranger did not rush to him, but he allowed Lucas to place one hand against the thick fur at his neck. "Old man," Lucas said quietly. "You still carrying everybody?" Ethan heard something in his voice. Not surprise, recognition. Lucas stood and gestured toward the shop. "Come in before the cold starts charging rent." Inside, a wood stove glowed red in the corner. Tools hung with military precision along the wall. On a shelf above the workbench stood a photograph of Lucas standing beside Nathan Crowley. Nathan looked older than in the photo at Owen's ranch. Lean, tired, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a wool cap. No uniform, no medals, no trace of the man Ethan had trapped in memory. Lucas saw him looking. "Crowley fixed that transmission," he said. "Truck was mine. Business was dead. I was drinking breakfast and calling it weather." Ethan remained quiet. Lucas leaned against the workbench. "I was Army. Came back wrong. Lost my marriage. Lost my house. Nearly lost the habit of waking up." His voice held no self-pity. Only the flat honesty of a man who had already wrestled shame and no longer felt the need to decorate it. Nathan showed up here one winter with that dog and asked if I knew how to rebuild carburetors. Did you? No. Did he? Also no. For the first time that morning, Ethan laughed. It surprised both of them. Lucas smiled faintly. But he stayed, learned with me, failed with me. Burned 2 manuals in that stove by accident and claimed it was a tactical decision. The humor passed, leaving something deeper behind. He never said much about himself. Lucas continued. But he knew what it meant when a man stopped answering the phone. Ethan looked toward Ranger through the open door. The dog had settled beside the truck, front paws crossed, watching the road. Lucas followed his gaze. Ranger was worse back then. Wouldn't let anybody touch his right side. Crowley never forced him. What did he do? Sat nearby every day until the dog decided the world hadn't ended. Lucas looked back at Ethan. He did the same for me. The second name on Vivian's list belonged to Marlene Voss, a widow who ran a small boarding house in Driggs. She was 76, narrow as a candle, with white hair pinned beneath a knitted blue cap and a voice that could have cut bread crusts from across the room. She opened the door, saw Ethan, then Ranger, and pressed one hand to her chest. "Oh," she said. The word held more history than Ethan expected. Ranger stepped forward and touched his nose lightly to her gloved hand. Marlene closed her eyes. Nathan said he was too dignified for affection. Ethan looked at Ranger, who appeared deeply uninterested in defending himself. Marlene invited them inside. Her house smelled of lemon polish and cinnamon. Framed photographs covered the hallway. Most of them of people Ethan did not know. On a small table near the window sat a jar full of folded notes. "Nathan paid my mortgage for 19 months, Marlene said without ceremony. Ethan stopped. "He what? My husband died with medical bills stacked higher than God's patience. I was going to lose this place." She poured tea with a hand that trembled only slightly. Checks started arriving. No return address, just enough each month. "How did you know it was him?" "I didn't. Not at first." She gave Ethan a sharp look. People who are helped by ghosts eventually become curious. She opened the jar and removed one folded note. It was written in pencil. "Mrs. Voss, please keep the porch light on. Some men come home late, and not all of them know where else to go. N.C." Ethan read the words twice. Something moved painfully behind his ribs. Marlene watched him over the rim of her teacup. "He slept on that porch once," she said. "Nathan? Wouldn't come inside. Said walls could be noisy." Ethan understood that more than he wanted to. Marlene looked toward Ranger, who lay near the door with his head on his paws. That dog stayed awake all night beside him, like a little black and tan guardian angel with terrible manners. Terrible manners. He stole half a ham off my counter. Ethan looked at Ranger. Ranger did not appear ashamed. Marlene smiled, but her eyes shone. Nathan never wanted thanks. That irritated me. Gratitude is like pie. It should be accepted when offered. The final stop of the day was not a house. It was a low, weather-beaten building outside Jackson with a hand-painted sign that read Teton, Working Dog Rescue. A woman named Alma Price met Ethan at the kennel gate. She was in her 60s, broad-shouldered, brown-skinned, and brisk in the way of people who fed animals before feeding themselves. Her gray hair was braided down her back, and her coat was covered in fur from at least 3 different dogs. She barely looked at Ethan. Her attention went straight to Ranger. "Well, there he is," Alma said. "The king returns." Ranger's tail moved once. Only once. Apparently, that counted as celebration. Alma opened the gate. Inside, several older working dogs barked from heated runs. Some had clouded eyes. Some limped. One slept through the entire commotion as if retirement had finally given him the authority to ignore everybody. "Nathan built half this place," Alma said. "With whose money? His when he had it. Someone else's when he didn't. Mine when he annoyed me into it." Ethan followed her down the row. "He brought Ranger here first," Alma nodded. Poor old boy had a torn leg, cracked tooth, and enough distrust to fill a church basement. She paused near an empty run at the end. This was his. Ranger stood before the open space. For the first time all day, the dog seemed smaller. Not weak, not frightened, just older, as if memory had weight even for animals. Alma rested one hand on the gate. Nathan sat outside this run for 11 nights. 11? Would been 12? But Ranger finally came out and put his head in Nathan's lap. She glanced at Ethan. That man cried like somebody had opened a locked door inside him. Ethan looked away. The cold air smelled of straw, disinfectant, dog food, and snow. It smelled alive. Alma reached into her coat and removed a worn envelope. "He left this here." Ethan stiffened. "For me? For whoever Ranger brought." That sentence landed gently, but it did not land lightly. Ethan did not open the envelope. Not yet. He looked at Ranger. The old dog had turned toward him, amber eyes steady beneath the silver of age. All day, Ethan had followed Nathan through the lives he had touched. Not grand lives, not famous ones. A mechanic, a widow, a kennel full of discarded dogs, small places, ordinary rooms, porches, workshops, winter roads. But the shape emerging was no longer small. Nathan had not disappeared from the world. He had entered the parts of it no one clapped for. Ethan placed the envelope inside his coat. Outside the kennel, evening spread slowly over the snow. The mountains darkened into blue shadow, and the first stars appeared above the ridge. Ranger walked beside him to the truck, not ahead, not behind. Beside him. For the first time, Ethan noticed the difference. Before, the dog had been leading him toward Nathan. Now it felt as though Ranger was making sure Ethan did not turn back. Ethan opened the passenger door. Ranger looked at him. Then, with the heavy dignity of an old king accepting a poorly built throne, the German shepherd climbed inside. Ethan stood there. A moment, one hand on the door. He had begun the day looking for proof that Nathan had been better than he remembered. He ended it with something far harder. Proof that Nathan had kept loving a broken world quietly, stubbornly, and without asking that the world love him back. Ethan closed the door gently. Then he walked around to the driver's side and started the truck. For the first time in 17 years, the silence beside him did not feel empty. It felt entrusted. Ethan did not open the envelope in the truck. He drove home with Ranger beside him. The old German shepherd stretched across the passenger seat, as if he had been inspecting inferior human transportation all his life. The envelope rested inside Ethan's coat pocket. He felt its weight with every turn of the road. It was not heavy. That was the problem. A thing capable of changing a man should have weighed more. Outside, evening settled over Wyoming in layers of blue and silver. Snowbanks glowed faintly beneath the moon. Ranch fences passed in long dark lines. The mountains stood beyond them like ancient witnesses who had heard every confession and repeated none. Ranger slept most of the way, though once, near the turnoff to the cemetery road, he lifted his head. Ethan slowed without meaning to. The dog looked toward the darkness where Nathan's memorial waited beneath snow. For a moment, Ethan thought Ranger might want to go there. But the old shepherd only watched. Then, he lowered his head again. Ethan kept driving. That small decision felt larger than it should have. At home, the cabin was cold enough to make the windows ache. Ethan built a fire, fed it slowly, then set a bowl of water near the hearth. Ranger drank, circled once with old bones protesting each movement, and settled on the braided rug, as though he had decided the place was acceptable for temporary command. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, still wearing his coat. The envelope remained unopened. He removed it at last and placed it on the kitchen table. There was no name on the front, only a single line written in pencil. "If Ranger brings this to you, do not rush what follows." Ethan stared at the words. Nathan's handwriting had changed with age, but the pressure of it remained familiar, slightly angled. controlled until the final letters loosened, as if the hand had grown tired before the heart did. Ethan sat. The fire cracked softly behind him. Ranger watched from the rug, amber eyes half-lidded but not asleep. "You know what this is?" Ethan asked. The dog did not answer. That, Ethan thought, was the blessing of dogs. They never ruined silence by pretending to understand more than they did. He opened the envelope. Inside was a key. Small, brass, worn smooth at the teeth. There was also a folded note. "Owen kept the chest because I asked him to. I did not trust myself to burn it, and I did not trust the world to read it too soon. If you are Mercer, I am sorry. If you are not, then forgive me for leaving sorrow with the wrong stranger. The chest is in the tack room, beneath the old saddle blankets. N.C." Ethan read the note once, then again. His name sat there like a hand placed gently on an old wound. If you are Mercer, I am sorry. He should have felt anger. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt suddenly tired. The kind of tiredness that came when a man realized the past had not been a wall at all. It had been a door he had spent 17 years refusing to open. The next morning, Ethan called Claire Barrett. She met him at the ranch after sunrise, her hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her cheeks red from the cold. She carried a thermos in one hand and looked at Ranger before she looked at Ethan. "He came with you," she said. "Apparently." Claire smiled softly. "My grandfather would have said, that means you're either trusted or being supervised. Probably supervised. That sounds more likely." The tack room stood at the back of the barn, half hidden behind stacked hay bales and old harnesses. The air inside smelled of leather, dust, horse blankets, and winter trapped under wood. Claire held a flashlight while Ethan moved the saddle blankets. Beneath them sat a cedar chest about the size of a footlocker, plain, unmarked, protected from dust by an old canvas tarp. Ethan knelt slowly. For a while he did not reach for the key. Claire noticed. "I can leave you alone." "No." His voice came rougher than intended. "Stay." She nodded once and did not make the moment heavier by speaking. The key turned with a small click. Inside the chest were letters. Hundreds of them. Some tied with twine, some loose, some sealed, some never folded. They filled the box in careful bundles, marked by year and place. There were also photographs, newspaper clippings, veterinary receipts, and a black notebook worn soft at the corners. Not Samuel's notebook. Another one. Ethan lifted the first bundle. The top letter was addressed to a name he did not recognize. Corporal James Weller. Beside it in pencil, Nathan had written, "Did not send. His wife already carries enough." Ethan moved to another. Marlene Voss. "Did not send. She says thank you too much." Another Lucas Bell. "Did not send. He will mistake kindness for debt." Then one bundle near the bottom. Ethan Mercer. The letters were tied with a strip of faded blue cloth. Not many. 7. Maybe 8. Ethan stared at them until Claire lowered the flashlight slightly. Ranger stepped closer. The old dog did not nudge him. Did not whine. He simply stood beside Ethan's shoulder, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of him through his coat. That was when Ethan understood something he had been resisting all along. Ranger had not been leading him to evidence. He had been bringing him to the place Nathan had placed all the things he could not say while alive. A courtroom would have called it a record. A historian would have called it an archive. But standing in the cold tack room with snowlight leaking through gaps in the barn wall, Ethan knew it was neither. It was a man's unfinished heart. He untied the cloth. The first letter had no date. "Mercer, if this reaches you, then either I failed at staying gone or the dog has better judgment than I do. You were always angry in a disciplined way. I admired that more than I admitted. Anger gave you direction. I used to think that made you strong. Now I know direction is not the same as peace." Ethan stopped reading. His breath had gone shallow. Claire said nothing. Ranger leaned his weight lightly against Ethan's side. Ethan forced himself to continue. I do not know what you remember from that day. I barely trust what I remember myself. Heat, smoke, shouting, the taste of blood, your compass in the sand. You reaching for it like a fool, while everything burned. I pulled you back by the vest. You cursed at me. I think. I laughed, then the ridge went white. There was more, but Ethan had to lower the page. His hands had begun to shake. Not violently, just enough. Enough to betray him. He had remembered the compass. He had remembered the voice. But not Nathan's laugh. Not the hand on his vest. Not the moment mercy came dressed as command. Claire stepped quietly away, giving him the dignity of space without abandoning him. Outside the barn, wind moved across the fields. Ethan read on, "If you hate me, I understand. Hate is a shelter with hard walls. It keeps out questions. I lived inside my own for a while. But if one day the shelter fails, I hope you do not mistake its collapse for weakness. Some men survive by holding the line. Some survive by finally setting down the weapon they have aimed at themselves." Ethan folded the letter carefully. He could not read another one yet. Not there. Not with the barn around him, and Claire pretending not to see him come apart in small pieces. He placed the Mercer bundle inside his coat. Then he searched through the chest with growing reverence. The letters told a life without announcing it. Nathan writing to dead teammates on anniversaries. Nathan writing to dogs he had buried behind the rescue kennel. Nathan writing to strangers whose names he never expected history to remember. One note sat loose near the bottom, written on the back of a veterinary invoice. "Ranger bit Samuel today." Samuel claims it was a clinical disagreement. I told him Ranger has strong diagnostic instincts. Ethan laughed then, a broken little sound. Claire looked at him, startled. He handed her the note. She read it and smiled through sudden tears. "That sounds like Grandpa's kind of friend." Ethan nodded. For a while, they sorted in silence. Not reading everything, only understanding the scale of what had been left behind. Nathan had not built a monument. He had built an orchard of unsent words, each letter a seed placed in darkness, each one waiting for a season he had not lived to see. Near the bottom of the chest, Ethan found one final envelope. It was thicker than the others. The front read, "For whoever thinks telling the truth will fix everything." Ethan knew, before opening it, that this was meant for more than him. Vivian, Samuel, maybe anyone who had ever believed facts alone could rescue the dead from misunderstanding. Inside was a single page. "Tell what helps the living become kinder. Leave buried what only turns pain into spectacle. If they need a hero, give them the people who kept going. If they need my name, use it carefully. I belong to the ones who could not ask for help, and to the dog who waited longer than I deserved." Ethan sat back on his heels. The cold tack room blurred. He thought of Vivian's red notebook, Samuel's careful warnings, Lucas' repair shop, Marlene's porch light, Alma's empty kennel run, Ranger's slow walk past the grave. All of it gathered now into one terrible and tender responsibility. Nathan had left him no command, no order, no clean answer, only trust, and trust, Ethan was learning, could be heavier than blame. He closed the chest. Not because he was finished. Because he finally understood he was not meant to finish Nathan's story in one sitting. Some doors opened slowly for a reason. Claire helped him carry the chest to his truck. Ranger stood beside the tailgate, watching as Ethan secured it beneath a blanket. Before closing the truck bed, Ethan placed one hand on the cedar lid. "I'll be careful," he said. He did not know whether he was speaking to Nathan, to Ranger, to Claire, or to himself. Maybe to all of them. Ranger lowered his head once. Not approval, not forgiveness, something steadier, acknowledgement. Ethan drove away from Barrett Ranch, with the chest behind him and Ranger beside him. The road stretched white and quiet toward the mountains. For the first time, Ethan understood that the truth was not a thing to be seized. It was a thing to be carried, and if carried poorly, it could wound the very people it was meant to save. Spring came to Wyoming without asking permission. It did not arrive all at once. It came in small betrayals of winter, a drip from the barn roof, a strip of brown earth showing through the snow beside the road, a raven standing on a fence post with the confidence of a creature who knew the cold had lost its crown. Ethan Mercer noticed all of it now. For years he had measured seasons by maintenance. Snow tires, firewood, roof leaks, frozen pipes. Now, he noticed, thaw, maybe because something inside him had begun to do the same. The cedar chest sat in his cabin beneath the front window, covered by a folded wool blanket. Ethan did not hide it, but he did not display it either. He had spent weeks reading Nathan Crowley's letters slowly, never more than a few at a time. Some made him smile. Some made him sit for an hour without moving. Some he folded back exactly as he found them, because he understood they had not been written for him to consume. Ranger remained with him most nights. The old German shepherd still returned to the cemetery sometimes, but not every day. That change hurt Ethan in a way he did not expect. He had once wanted the dog to leave the grave behind. Now, each absence felt like proof that something final was approaching. Vivian Hale arrived on a clear morning in March with her red notebook, her camera, and a patience that looked uncomfortable on her. She stood on Ethan's porch, looking past him into the cabin. "May I come in?" Ethan stepped aside. Ranger lifted his head from the rug but did not rise. Vivian looked at him. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose I passed inspection last time." Ranger blinked. "That means nothing," Ethan said. "He blinks at furniture." Vivian almost smiled. Almost. The cedar chest waited by the window. Vivian saw it immediately, but she did not approach. That earned her something from Ethan, though he did not say so. He poured coffee. They sat at the kitchen table while morning light stretched across the floorboards. Vivian opened her notebook, then closed it again. "I've waited," she said. "You have. I don't do that often." "I noticed." She gave him a dry look, then her expression shifted. "Tell me what you found." Ethan rested both hands around his mug, not for warmth, for steadiness. "Letters. To whom?" "Everyone." Vivian waited. Ethan looked toward the chest. Men who lived, people he helped, dogs he buried. "Me." Vivian's face softened at the final word. She did not ask to read them. That was the second thing Ethan respected about her. Instead, she asked, what did he want? Ethan had asked himself that question every day. The answer never came as one sentence. Nathan had wanted to disappear. Nathan had wanted to be remembered. Nathan had wanted silence. Nathan had wanted the truth to help someone. Human beings were rarely kind enough to become simple after death. "He wanted care," Ethan said finally. Vivian tilted her head. "Care, with the story." She looked down at her closed notebook. "That can sound a lot like control." "I know. And control can sound a lot like hiding." "I know that too." Vivian leaned back. "So where does that leave us?" Before Ethan could answer, Ranger rose from the rug. Slowly. His old joints made the movement difficult, but he crossed the room and stood beside the cedar chest. He did not paw at it. He did not whine. He simply lowered his head to the blanket covering it. Vivian watched him. For once, no clever sentence arrived in her mouth. Ethan stood and removed one envelope from the chest. Not the private letters. Not the ones marked with names. Only the final page Nathan had left for whoever believed truth could fix everything. He handed it to Vivian. She read it standing. Her face changed by degrees. The firmness remained, but something in it quieted. "Tell what helps the living become kinder. Leave buried what only turns pain into spectacle." When Vivian finished, she did not speak for a long while. Outside, melting snow fell from the porch roof in soft, uneven drops. At last, she folded the page carefully. "You're not asking me to bury the story," she said. "No, you're asking me to tell a smaller one. I'm asking you to tell the right one." Vivian looked at him. And who decides what right means? Ethan glanced at Ranger, then at the chest, then at the mountains beyond the window. No one alone. That became the beginning, not of an article, not exactly, of something more useful. Over the next month, Ethan, Vivian, Samuel Reed, Claire Barrett, Alma Price, Lucas Bell, Marlene Voss, and Grace Holloway gathered the parts of Nathan's life that could be shared without stealing from the dead. Vivian interviewed people Nathan had helped. She did not ask them to perform their pain. Samuel helped Ethan decide which details belonged to medicine, which belonged to memory, and which belonged to no one but Nathan. Claire donated a portion of Owen Barrett's ranch property. Alma offered kennel space, staff contacts, and a list of retired working dogs with nowhere to go. Lucas rebuilt the old equipment shed into a heated workshop where veterans could repair engines, furniture, and maybe pieces of themselves. Marlene brought baked bread every Friday and criticized everyone's folding chairs. Grace arranged a quiet marker near Nathan's memorial with one added line beneath his name. He helped the ones who could not ask. No medals, no classified mission details, no dramatic headline. Only enough truth to open a door. By late April, the Crowley Foundation held its first public gathering. It was not grand. A few folding tables stood outside the refurbished barn. Coffee steamed from silver urns. A dozen veterans came, some with spouses, some alone, some pretending they had only stopped by to look at the dogs. 3 retired working dogs rested in the sunshine near the fence. One had clouded eyes. One was missing part of an ear. One barked at a wheelbarrow for reasons known only to God and himself. Ranger sat beside Ethan near the entrance, his old leather collar dark against his thick winter coat. He looked thinner now. The silver had spread farther along his muzzle, but his eyes remained steady. People approached him carefully, as though they understood, without being told that this dog had earned the right not to be crowded. Vivian stood near the barn with her camera hanging unused at her side. "You could say something," she told Ethan. "I could also step on a rake. Doesn't make it wise. You're the reason this exists." "No," Ethan said. He looked across the yard, at Alma helping a gray-haired veteran kneel beside a nervous shepherd mix, at Lucas laughing with a man who had not made eye contact with anyone all morning, at Marlene forcing bread into Samuel's hands while he tried politely to refuse, at Grace standing beside Nathan's new marker with her thermos tucked under one arm. Nathan is. Vivian studied him. And Ranger. Ethan looked down. Ranger leaned lightly against his leg. The gesture was small, barely there, but Ethan felt it all the way through him. He made sure we noticed. That evening, after the last truck left and the barn settled into quiet, Ethan found Ranger at the edge of the property. The dog stood facing the mountains. The snow had retreated from the lower fields, leaving the earth dark and wet beneath the fading light. "Ready to go home?" Ethan asked. Ranger did not move. Ethan walked closer. The old shepherd's breathing sounded slow, steady, tired. For a moment, Ethan thought of ordering him back, a foolish instinct, a human instinct, to keep what he loved within reach. Instead, he stood beside him and looked toward the ridge. "You did good," Ethan said. The words were too small, they always were. Ranger turned his head. His amber eyes met Ethan's. Then he pressed his muzzle once against Ethan's hand. Not long, not sentimental, just once. The next morning, Ranger was gone. Ethan found no sign of struggle, no broken fence, no blood in the snowmelt. Only the impression of where the old dog had slept near the porch, and a line of paw prints leading toward the high ridge beyond the ranch. Ethan followed them as far as the hilltop. The tracks climbed through wet grass, patches of old snow and exposed stone. Near the top, they stopped. Not ended. Stopped, as if Ranger had stood there for a while, looking down on the valley, the cemetery, the foundation, and all the living things Nathan's kindness had gathered. Then the ground turned rocky and bare. The prince disappeared. Ethan remained on the ridge long after the sun rose. He did not call Ranger's name. Some departures were not requests to be interrupted. Below him, the valley opened in morning light. The Crowley Foundation sat small and real beneath the mountains. Smoke rose from the barn chimney. A truck turned slowly into the drive. Another day beginning, another door opening. Ethan reached into his pocket and took out the old compass. For years, he had used it as a reminder that direction mattered. Now he understood something else. A compass did not make the journey for a man. It only told him when he had stopped pretending. He closed it gently. Wind moved over the ridge, carrying the last cold breath of winter. Ethan looked once more at the place where Ranger's tracks had vanished. Loyalty, he realized, was not staying forever. It was guarding what mattered until someone else was ready to carry it. And at last, Ethan was. Sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty are not the ones the world sees. Nathan spent years helping people without asking for recognition. Ranger waited faithfully, not to glorify the past, but to make sure the right person found the truth when the time was right. Maybe that's a reminder for all of us. Not every kindness is remembered. Not every sacrifice is rewarded. But God often works through quiet people, small acts, and faithful hearts in ways we may never fully understand. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of Nathan and Ranger's journey stayed with you the most? And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, hope, and the extraordinary bond between people and dogs, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the next journey. May God bless you with peace, steady companions, and the wisdom to recognize the quiet miracles already walking beside you.